Good morning. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Vijayakumar and 3D Con for inviting me here today. So this session is going to be on diabesity, and there are two talks in this session. The first part is going to be about causes and consequences, followed by which we'll be talking a little about management. So diabesity, causes and consequences, and I have no conflict of interest to declare. Now, what is diabesity? Now, this is a term that is a little controversial, not well accepted everywhere. It's simply a combination of diabetes and obesity, because these two occur together. The combination of these is diabesity. Now, if you look at the natural history of obesity, you'll see that for diabetes, obesity is in the causal pathway. So the first step happens with obesity, usually due to excess nutrients, etc. This leads to insulin resistance. From there, we go to the pre-glycemic, hyperglycemic, dysglycemic states, IGT, IFG. From there, hyperglycemia, and then on to complications and disability. So this is the natural history of obesity leading to diabetes. So when you say the causal pathway, there are many mechanisms by which these two entities are linked together. But today I'm going to be talking about three hypotheses. The first one is called the inflammation hypothesis. Now, to understand this, one must know the term called metaflammation. Now, what is this? This is a chronic low-grade inflammatory state that is a response by metabolic cells to chronic dietary excess of nutrients. So what happens when there's excess of nutrients? There is a cytokine release. The macrophages inside the adipose tissue release all of these cytokines. So you can see them there. The TNF-alpha, like weak adiposity-related protein, the monocyte chemotatic protein, the IL-1, IL-6, etc. So all of these cytokines come out from the infiltrating macrophages. Then what do? They do a whole lot of things. So typically they act on the adipose tissue, the peripheral muscle, the pancreas itself, the liver. So these are the key organs, is it not? And they introduce insulin resistance. How do they do this? The mechanisms are very, very complex. But primarily, if you look in the insulin, if you look at the insulin receptor itself, the insulin signaling gets a little gets blocked. There is a pathway problem. Now, if you look in the muscle, it releases all reactogen oxygen species. You look at these things, ceramides, diacylglycerol, stuff like this are lipotoxic agents that interfere with insulin signaling. They cause DNA fragmentation and apoptosis. So due to this, the insulin signaling pathway is then is disrupted, and this leads to insulin resistance. So the same story in the adipose tissue, in the skeletal muscle, in the pancreas, similarly in the liver as well. There is increase of the triglyceride secretion. So all of this leads to either there's suppressed glucose production, impaired beta cell secretion, impaired glucose disposal, etc. So this is inflammation hypothesis. The next one is the lipid overflow hypothesis. Now, what does this mean? Now, adipose tissue is typically a passively expanding tissue. So the more and more nutrients that come, the more and more adipose tissue is formed. But after a critical point, there is a theory that there is a lipid overflow. So what happens, instead of going and sitting in the peripheral tissues, adipocytes, what happens is that there is spill onto visceral organs. So again, same thing happens, whether it's a skeletal muscle, there is myocellular fat. So there are two things what happens. One is there's a hyperplasia, that is number of cells increase, and there's a hypertrophy. So it is this hypertrophy that actually causes the insulin resistance through pretty much the same pathways. You have it here, the CPT1, the HAD activity, etc. All of these cause insulin resistance in the periphery. Similar things happen in the pancreas, ceramides, diacylglycerol, as well as in the liver. So we all know about the twin cycle hypotheses, how fat sits on the liver, fat sits on the pancreas. Even a 0.5 gram increase in fat sitting on the pancreas can cause impaired insulin secretion, as well as glucose disposal. So first one is inflammation. Now you have the lipotoxic effects of the fat causing damage to the peripheral tissues. That is the lipid overflow hypothesis. The third hypothesis is called the adipokine hypothesis. So here what happens is that excess adipose tissue secretes adipokines. Now what are these? These are things like leptin, resistance, adiponectin, retinol binding protein 4, etc. Now what are the actions? Now leptin has a central CNS action. It acts on the hypothalamus, suppresses appetite, and helps to decrease energy intake. Things like adiponectin work on the periphery through the AMP kinase pathway. It also works on the liver to actually help in glucose disposal, suppresses gluconeogenesis. So adiponectin, leptin, they're good guys. Things like resistin, they have an opposite effect. So adipokines have both good and bad effects. There are new ones coming every day. Vasaptin, there are so many, visfatin, so many are there. Some of them have insulin sensitivity action. Some have insulin resistant action. So depending on the amount of fat and which ones get upregulated, this is genetically programmed as to which one comes out and thus produces insulin resistance. Hence, I've showed you that there are 3 mechanisms or hypotheses by which obesity can cause insulin resistance, primarily causing diabetes, but it can also affect insulin secretion, again causing diabetes. So this together, if you look at diabesity, there are many, many causes. I told you there are genetic factors. So if you look at, we know the FTO gene and the TCF7L2 are the obesity and the diabetes secretory genes respectively, but there are many, many other genes. 9 more genes are under investigation as causes of obesity. However, this is a very small part of the obesity that we're dealing in. The larger obesity comes from dietary factors, lifestyle factors, the built environment, and I'm going to talk to you a little more about that, stress, etc. Now, these are factors that all of us are very familiar with. But I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the built environment, food and physical activity in terms of the built environment. So this is a 4-country study funded by NHR called as GHRU, the Global Health Research Unit. It's UK funded, and there's India, there's Chennai, there's Delhi, then there's Bangladesh, there's Sri Lanka, and there's Pakistan. These are all the sites that are involved in this study. So in Chennai, of the 144 wards, we've sampled everything for the surveillance study, but here for the built environment study, this is work of a PhD student called Aarti. So this is what she did. She took 2 of these wards and not only studied the individual health data, but also have the environment data, which is the food environment, the physical activity environment, and linked this to diabesity. So this was her PhD thesis work. So what did she find? So given here, this is Chennai city alone. Look at the prevalence of obesity. Blue is males and the pink are females. The prevalence of obesity in urban Chennai, this is 2021 data that was done, it's 82%. And here she has a combination of both abdominal obesity and BMI related. It's really, really high in urban Chennai. If you look at earlier data, you'll see there's a clear increase in the prevalence of obesity, and this is adults above 20 years of age. Look at diabetes prevalence, whopping numbers there, both among men and women. So if you look at diabesity, we see 37% in females and about 30% in males. So these are the figures. Look at the age-wise distribution. As you would expect, diabetes, there is a continuum. There is an increase in the diabetes prevalence with age. Obesity also, it's like that, but you will see that after a particular age, after about 60 years of age, there is a dip in obesity levels, and that is very much expected. Sarcopenia, other things. So these are all the data that she has shown, and diabesity follows the same pattern. Now, this is a very interesting thing. This is the food environment, okay? Now, we're looking at something called as Retail Food Environment Index, RFEI. Now, what is this? This is number of healthy food outlets versus number of unhealthy food outlets in a particular area. So remember, we went to people's houses and studied. We then do a mapping. So what are these buffer areas? So you draw around a person's house, you draw an area, say 300 meter, 400 meter around a person's house, and look at all the various stores and available things around that person's house. So that is what this comes. How do we do this? We do this through GIS mapping, and this particular thing has been done also with physical audits. So she was a PhD student. She went house to house for her study and did physical audits around that buffer area around a patient's house. So what we found is that for every person, so look at this, with diabesity, look at the 400-meter buffer, 1.89. So that means, what does that actually mean? For every person residing in the study area, this person was surrounded roughly by 2 fast food outlets or unhealthy outlets for every healthy outlet. That's what she's saying. So for every grocery store or health food outlet, there are 2 unhealthy options available for this person. So that's what she was able to show here. Now, what does that mean? Does that relate to other, things like, she's looked at waist circumference, and this is basically diabesity. Does this relate to that? Yes, it has a definite availability of food outlets is related to obesity. It was not related to sugar levels in this particular study. Then she looked at the prevalence of diabesity along with this score. So what she shows is that those who have a score of more than 1.9 or 2 have a 1.5 times higher risk of developing diabesity. So what does this mean? Availability of food outlets, obesity, and diabesity. That's what she's showing. Now let's quickly look at physical activity. So what does she show here? If you are more physically inactive, then you have more diabesity, and that is quite clear. Now, let's look at, just like we said, dietary areas, food areas, physical activity areas, parks, green spaces, gyms, etc. So she looked at the availability of physical activity areas within a 1 kilometer, rather a 1.1 kilometer radius of that person's house. So if there was a more than 1 kilometer distance to the physical activity area, this was associated with more diabesity. Again, when she did this, now when she did it by diabesity, there was definitely a 1.6 higher time risk of not having a physical activity area around a person's house. So have unhealthy options, diabetes is present. Not have healthy physical activity options, diabetes is present. That's what she's showing. But we also had to show one more thing. We had to show within a physical activity area, it's not enough. If there's an area, do people actually do physical activity? The answer is yes. If it's available, people are able to go to a park and walk or whatever it is. So within a 1.8 kilometer radius of a person's house, availability of green space helps to increase physical activity. This is called reduced rank reduction. So what we do here is that normal regression, you only have a single variable output. Here you're able to look at multiple variable outputs and come out with patterns for this person. So what does this mean? What we're able to see is that we looked at multiple things. We looked at fruit intake, vegetable intake, family income, physical activity, RFEI, distance to physical, all these things together. You can put it in a single regression, and this is called RRR. So what we are, not the movie, this is a regression, okay? So what we show here is that if people have 2 patterns, an unhealthy pattern and a healthy pattern. The unhealthy pattern is live far away from physical activity area, have access to all these unhealthy food outlets, eat less fruit, eat less vegetable, do less exercise, etc. All of these are significantly linked with obesity. And these are the tertiles of the regression. So what we see is that clearly, look at the first one, diabesity, it's clearly increasing with increase in the unhealthy pattern. So further away a physical activity area is, more damage. For closer, you have unhealthy food outlets, more damage. Less physical activity, more damage. So like that, we are able to show. Now, but this is only from Chennai. Do we have any national data on this? We do. From the ICMR study, which has about 1 lakh population inside of the study, we are able to show, I'm very, very happy to say that this data has just been accepted in Lancet DNE, just came last week, and this is the first national data on diabetes. 15 years of work has culminated in this paper, is just accepted. These are the diabetes prevalence state-wise in our country. You have urban areas and rural areas. So this is the diabetes prevalence. Look, it's color-coded. Red is 10% and above. Green is below 5%. So you can see India overall, how it is. South and all is very red. North is very red. In between, we have some yellows and greens. But look at obesity. Whole of urban India is red. Obesity, and here we're talking about 25% prevalence and 15% prevalence is green. So you can see the numbers are absolutely different. This is abdominal obesity. This is our country and abdominal obesity, 25% prevalence. Whole country has about 25% prevalence. So what is the prevalence of diabesity overall? It's 6.7 in whole of India, urban, rural, etc. you'll see very similar maps to the Chennai data, what I showed. There is an increase in age of diabesity. Numbers increase pretty much. So the consequences, well, they are the consequences, of course, obesity and diabetes. You have sleep apnea, digestive problems, PCOS, fatigue, osteoarthritis, infertility, gallbladder disease, stress, quality of life, all cause mortality. Now, the important thing to note is that these are all the complications of obesity. Everything worsens with uncontrolled glycemia. Complications of diabetes, macrovascular, this audience does not need this at all, but just important to note that all of these worsen with obesity. So the diabesity is there. I'm not going to go into the management, but I just want to tell you that one has to look at this at all levels, the individual, the community, and the government. We now know that access to areas helps to increase physical activity, decrease, so access to healthy foods will help to decrease diabesity. At the community level, your gated communities, access to areas, etc. help. And also, as far as the nutrient goes, trying to decrease the carbohydrate intake and increase protein intake will definitely help to reverse diabetes as well as obesity. So I'd like to conclude by saying diabetes is present in about 1/3 of our population. It's lower in rural than urban, but rural is catching up. It's affecting younger individuals, and this is a problem because there is morbidity and mortality, disastrous effects on the economy. Health impact has long-term effects. There are complications of both diabetes and obesity which get compounded, and we definitely do need measures that are outside of our traditional measures. We talk only about the individual level, but perhaps it's time to think outside this box, because tackling the twin epidemic of diabesity is becoming a very, very important need of the hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you.